all for joining us. We have about 90 or 101 of you on the line right now. We're expecting 142. I'd like to introduce the vice chair of our conference committee, Dr. Robin Barbiers, the executive director of the Anti-Cruelty Society in Illinois. And Robin, if you could introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. As Jeannie has mentioned several times, I'm Robin Barbiers, and I'm president of the Anti-Cruelty Society in Chicago, and I'm also the vice chair of the SAWA Conference Committee. First, I'd like to thank Jeannie for setting all of this beyond labels, understanding the true impact of live release rates and intake policies. Our presenter, Roger Haston, earned his Ph.D. in geophysics from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Roger worked as a geophysicist for Amoco and Arco in Houston, Texas, and had the good fortune to travel all over the world. During this time, he continued his educational pursuit and received an MBA in finance from Rice University. Roger moved to Colorado in 1998, where he started and grew a successful business in geophysical data processing. I'm not even sure what that is. But wanting to create a broader social impact, he committed to giving back to the community and got involved with Humane Society of Boulder Valley as a volunteer, board member, and eventually board chair. He also worked with both for-profit and nonprofit organizations on strategy and leadership development, with a strong focus on creating mission-driven organizations. His passion for helping animals continued to grow, and in 2012, he committed himself full-time to animal welfare and took over as executive director at the Animal Assistance Foundation, where he has merged his passion for science, business, and people to help the animals of Colorado and beyond. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger Haston.
Thank you very much. Really an honor to be asked to give this webinar, and I really hope today will be informative and educational for everybody. You know, my background really did not start in animal welfare, but now I've been involved in it for about 15 years. But most of my career has really been centered around working and analyzing large quantities of data, and that's one trend I've seen in animal welfare over the last 10 years, is the desire and need for more and more data and how to deal with that data. And one thing about data, on its own, it has very little value. It's what we need are tools to turn that data into knowledge and understanding. And what I hope to show you today is some tools for taking some of that data and really maybe starting to understand that a little better. And I really have three goals. One is to introduce the concept of stochastic modeling and give you a glimpse into how powerful that technique can be for analyzing and understanding complex data and systems. The other is to give you a rational framework for how to think about some of the really complex issues that we face in animal welfare. And finally, which I think is the most important, is I want you all to be able to walk out of here and be able to impress your friends with the command of the use of the word stochastic. So I hope you'll be able to do that. I always like to have every session have some ground rules, and this is animal welfare, so I like to break it down to the basics. And I have cameras installed in all your rooms, so on the left, that is not what I want. On the right is definitely where I want. That's my dog, Ringo, by the way. Had to shamelessly put him in the presentation. This is not a lightweight talk. It really is, we're going to cover a lot of complicated things that range from math to statistics to data characterizations. We're going to talk a little bit about philosophy. We're going to talk about physics, and we're going to talk about animal welfare. We're going to bring those all together. I will confess I am a nerd. I'm not even a reform nerd. I tried to reform myself, but that hasn't happened. And I like to think about these things a lot. And I want to show you with this presentation today some of those thoughts that I've had about how to try to bring our compassion for animals together with really trying to build a long-term framework for creating a better world. So I think the most important thing really is to first start off to talk about what is animal welfare. And for me, the 5 freedoms framework, and there's a number of definitions of it, but the 5 freedom framework for me makes up one of the most concise and robust definitions of animal welfare, because I think it is fairly simple and it's easy to relate to, but it's very powerful. And the 5 freedoms are the freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. And I think those really, when we start to think about what animal welfare is, when we think about those 5 freedoms, that really encompasses so much of what you guys try to do every single day. So now I'm going to talk, we're going to go into probably the heavy lifting part of the talk, and that's really to introduce you to the concept of stochastic modeling and simulation. And some of you may use this every day. Some of you may have some vague knowledge of what stochastic modeling is. Some of you may have no idea at all. But what I'm going to show you and what I'm going to convince you here right in the very beginning is that you all have a pretty strong sense for what stochastic modeling is, and you have a pretty strong belief that it's a powerful tool. And I think one of the most powerful things about it when we think about analyzing data is our need to predict the future, that what we do today will have an impact on what's going to happen tomorrow. And what stochastic modeling brings to the table is that ability to predict the future. And I don't know how many of you, like I said, I'm a nerd. I don't know how many of you ever played Dungeons and Dragons in college or high school, but Dungeons and Dragons is a form of stochastic modeling. And I'm going to show you a picture now of 1900 Galveston Hurricane, and you might wonder why I would put this up here. But back then, weather forecasting was really in the very, very rudimentary state, and they didn't have a lot of knowledge about the behavior of hurricanes. And the U.S. Weather Bureau in 1900 ignored reports from Cuban meteorologists about this hurricane, and some assumptions they had about how hurricanes worked became fact, and they did not evacuate Galveston Island, and in fact, it was one of the most devastating hurricanes ever to hit the U.S. Almost 12,000 people lost their lives. And I put this up here because what we now have is, if we think about modern day hurricane forecasting, it really, so much of it is driven by stochastic modeling. And if you live on the Gulf Coast, you see all the time when hurricanes are out in the Gulf, these probability strike maps of how likely a hurricane may hit a point. And this is some stochastic modeling from Katrina that showed that highly likely that it was going to hit New Orleans, which it did. It was an incredibly devastating hurricane, but because we have the ability to forecast and predict where the hurricane was going to hit, it was far less devastating than it would have been if it was 1900. And this is a form of stochastic modeling that we see all the time. And in fact, every day we go out and we think about whether we need to take an umbrella with us. That 40% chance of rain, really, that's another form of stochastic modeling. Another topic that's been really big in the conversation in the world is really about global warming. And maybe you have never asked yourself, but I think it's a good question to ask. How do I know what the temperature of the Earth is going to be in 2100? Well, the reason we know this is through stochastic modeling, where we understand how the weather patterns and the temperature of the Earth works, and we can now start to look ahead into the future and understand that what we're doing today can have a significant impact on the world in 2100. And this has, really become a pretty powerful technique for looking at complex data that we're measuring today and really understanding what the impact of our actions are going off into the future. So really, the basics of stochastic modeling, it's a technique for analyzing data and predicting outcomes from a set of variables and conditions. And the nice thing about it is what we know is so often there isn't the average of something doesn't tell us exactly what's going to happen. There might be a hoarding case that increases the number of intakes on a particular day. And the good thing in stochastic modeling is that it counts for that variability. And the other thing that I think is one of the most critical, and I'm going to show you a lot of that today, is really it's a way to assess the interaction between all the variables in a system, not just one at a time. And that way we can start to understand the true impact of one decision has on other attributes within the model. And in this model, what I've tried to do is really look at some of the fundamental things that cause a shelter to operate, things like the type of animal, how many intakes, length of stay, how much it cost. And we tried to take that data and calibrate it to real shelter operations and some published data. And that's what I'll show you as well. So how does the process work? Because the whole term model can be a little bit confusing, and it's really not that confusing at all. But the first step in the process is that we take our real data and we characterize that data. And in this case, we'd be looking at daily intakes, type of animal, the length of stay that we would expect from a particular animal, how much it cost, adoption revenue, all those kind of things that are very normal to a shelter operation. And we would characterize those into probability distributions. And I'm not going to talk a lot about probability distributions today, but it's just a way that we can represent that real data in a way that is much more robust than the data itself. We then create a model, and that's simply putting all the input parameters in, and then we run a simulation and track the outputs of that model. And then we compare those outputs, which would be things like adoption, shelter capacity, length of stay, cost, adoption revenue, and then we compare that to what we know exists in real data. And that is the process. And it's an iterative process that can go around this loop several times. So the first thing I want to talk about is really data characterization and seeing through the noise. Because so much of the data we look at is complicated, I wanted to spend some time really talking about this first step, data characterization, because it is one of the most critical. And so often when I see data analysis presentations, one of the fundamental errors that gets made is that actually properly characterizing data does not happen, and yet this is one of the most fundamental steps, and I'm going to show you a simple example of that. And really, when we have a system operating, and say for a shelter producing adoptions, that would be a system operating, it produces outcomes, and that would be outcome data. And the outcome data is a result of a system that has multiple parameters, and in this case, adoptions might be the type of animals coming in, how much capacity is in that particular shelter, how much advertising they did. All these things work together to create an adoption. And the problem is with outcome data, understanding causality in that outcome data is very difficult because it is the cumulative effect of all those variables that go into it. And when we look at outcome data, it tends to have a lot of variance. So it's very important to start to understand where that variance comes from, because there's an awful lot of information in there. So what in data characterization is so key is that we break down the system down to its fundamental input components so we can start to really understand what that outcome data means. So I'm going to do a real simple example here, but I think it's a powerful one. And I do some triathlons, and I do them slowly, but I do manage to do them. And as so many things in this day and age, we track all our times. And what I've shown here is a graph of my run times over a 10K course. And you can see they're pretty spread out over, from 55 minutes all the way up to 63.5 minutes. And I'm about ready to head out on my morning run, and I want to bet you $100 I can run that 10K in 60.5 minutes or less. And the question is, should you take the bet? And this is really, we're talking about ways to predict the future, and I'm going to give you hints, and that is 94% of the times in the past I run faster than 60.5 minutes. And I think most rational people would look at that and say, there is no way I'm going to take that bet based on the data you presented to me. But we have to ask the question, why is that data spread over such a large chunk of time? There's a pretty big difference between 55 and 63.5 minutes. And why is there so much variability in the data? And I think that question right there so often does not get asked, and yet it's one of the most fundamental questions in understanding data. So you find out that I run 2 different courses, and that my performance is negatively affected by alcohol. So you have more information now. And the first thing we would do is we want to now characterize along those fundamental variables, and that would be, let's split the data into more relevant grouping, which would be by course. And now if you look at course 1, which is in blue, and course 2, which is in yellow, you can see that I'm definitely much faster on course 1 than course 2. And then you see a few outliers out there that were at times when I went to a fundraiser the night before, and there was a lot of free wine provided, so it really affected me. So you find out I plan to run on course 2. And then the question is, should you take the bet? But let's build a model, because now we know we have a couple input variables and we want to create an expected outcome. But you find out I'm going to a big fundraiser the night before, and it has Dave Matthews playing, and I love Dave Matthews, so I almost certainly will probably have more wine than I should. So let's build a model, and we're going to use the variables in that model to predict the outcome. So we know that I'm running course 1, and my mean on course 1 is 59.5, and it ranges between 57 and 61. And then our second variable is, did I drink wine the night before or not? And the answer is yes, and that usually adds 3 to 5 minutes to my time. And so when now we run that model, my expected outcome is almost certainly going to be more than 60.5 minutes. So we went from something that was obviously don't take the bet to you should definitely take this bet. And we did that by breaking the outcome data down to its fundamental parts and starting to understand the likelihood of a particular outcome. And that is really fundamentally, in a very kind of funny and simplistic way, what stochastic modeling is. So let's take a look now at the animal shelter simulator. And I called it Wagsberg USA because we've always got to have cute names. So we're going to look at a simulation, and in Wagsberg they just built a brand new shelter. It's expected to bring in about 3,000 animals a year. And the model is going to simulate the operation of this shelter at different live release rate, under different live release rate policies. And we're going to track the operation of that shelter every single day for 1 year. Oops, sorry. I see I had a question here. How does stochastic modeling differ from multivariate linear regression? The difference in stochastic modeling as comparatively is that multivariate linear regression does not look at multiple outcomes with the variability and randomness of some variables. It tries to fit to a singular outcome. And we can talk about that more. The power of stochastic modeling is that it accounts for all that variability. All right, I'll have to keep my eye out for those. I'm still getting used to the webinar format here. So a couple definitions and assumptions first. The number of adoptions, live release rate in this model is defined as number of adoptions by the number of intakes. I've taken out some of the complexities that are around live release rate, and we're trying to keep the model simple at this point so that you can just fundamentally see how it operates. There's really only two possible outcomes in this model. Either an animal is adopted or it gets euthanized. All animals coming in the shelter are owner surrender, so I haven't dealt with animals that don't come in. That's the only way they come in. And then the last definition is unserviced animals, animals that were brought to the shelter but could not get in due to space. The key input parameters for this simulation are really around animal population. It's the type of animal, and I've calibrated that to shelter data, expected length of stay, expected cost for additional medical and behavior, expected adoption revenue. Within the shelter, there's an intake policy, a kennel capacity, a base cost per day, and a euthanasia policy. And all those parameters were set. So one of the key here was to look at the animal population characteristics, and what I tried to do was approximate along Asilomar class ranges, but I broke it down into 5 different, or actually 6 different classes. Class 1 would be puppies, Class 2 would be highly adoptable, Class 3 would have minor issues, Class 4 would have some behavior or maybe less desirable breeds. Class 5 would have significant issues and adoptable under special circumstances, and then something I call Class 5S would be truly unadoptable. And you can see under percent of population this is the percent of the animals coming in at each one of those classes. So 10% of the animals coming into the shelter are puppies, 5% are Class 5S, so on and so forth. There's an expected length of stay for each one of those classes and some variability around that. So there's a mean time that a puppy would be there, that would be 4 days, and a little bit of variability, 0.4. If we go down to, say, Class 5S, what we'd see that the mean for a Class 5S animal would be 180 days with a standard deviation of 36 days. So there's quite a bit of variability in the expected length of stay as an animal, the higher the class. There's some base cost per day, some additional cost, behavior and medical costs that have variability as well, and then some adoption expected adoption revenue. So a puppy would get $350. A Class 5 animal would get 0. So if we look at that percentage of animals that I used in the model and compare it to some shelter data, this is that comparison. So in yellow was the data, the distribution I used in the model. In blue was the average from some shelter data that I pulled from around the country, with the gray bars showing the standard deviation. So really I used a percentage that approximates what's coming into many shelters around the country. If we look at length of stay, which is really a critical thing, if we compare in the model the expected length of stay for the population and compare it to some published data from Brown et al. In 2013, what we see really here is what's most critical is the shape of this curve is that most of the animals are in and out of the shelter pretty quickly within 28 days, and then there is a long tail that stretches out past a year. But the data correlates quite well to published data, so once again the model is fit pretty well to length of stay data that has been looked at. We look at expected daily cost distribution. What we see also is most of the animals come in, have a fairly low cost, and then there's a long tail, a long narrow tail that stretches out for more expensive animals. And this would be, the case where, say, an animal comes in, just needs a simple vaccine, might just be $15 a day, but an animal that, say, had a significant orthopedic issue or something, a behavior issue, might require a much higher level of cost. And finally, if we look at expected arrivals per day, because we never know exactly how many animals are going to come in on any one particular day, this shows, on average, we expected about 3,000 animals. On average, about 8 animals a day come in, but you can see that there's a distribution around that. Some days it's 13, some days it's 2, and we never know exactly going from day to day. So let's now, that was kind of the heavy lifting, most heavy lifting part of this talk, and that is really trying to describe to you what the model looks like. I think now the most important part is really what are the results from that. And so let's take a look. And we're going to start kind of looking at the metrics that would be at the front door of this shelter. And if we look at cumulative intakes over the year, so we start off in all 3 cases, in yellow is 85% live release rate, red is 90, blue is 95, and we watch the operation for a year and track how many animals each of those situations were able to let into the shelter. What you can see, there's a 28% drop in intakes at the 95% live release rate. So in the 95% live release rate case, it was only able to intake about 2,000 animals versus about the 2,800 that were in the 85% live release rate. And then one of the rules was that the shelter would intake the animal if there is room, and if we compare number of animals, unserviced animals, or animals turned away at the front door because there was not room, And if we look at that over time, we can see that after a year, in the 95% live release case, about 850 animals have been turned away, about 300 in the 90% case, and none in the 85%. So let's take a look at shelter capacity. How full are our kennels? And if we look there, what we see in the 95% live release rate case is that very quickly that shelter, after about 60 days, fills up to 100% and then stays full for the whole rest of the time. In the 90% case, it takes a little bit longer for that shelter to fill up, but after about 120 days, it's full, and it stays full for the whole year. In the 85% case, it climbs up to about 80% full and then stabilizes around that level. And I think one of the most important things to understand why both the intakes are less and why so many animals got turned away in the 95% case versus the 85% case is to look at the inventory of animals, the type of animals in the shelter over time. If we look at the 85% live release case, what you see is that it fills up with 1 through 4, class 1 through 4 animals, and stabilizes with that standard inventory over time. And this is because they're euthanizing the class 5 and 5S's. We look at the 90% live release rate, what you see is that it starts to fill up with class 5, and each of those class 5s are taking up about 35% of the shelter capacity after a year. And if we look at the 95% live release rate, what we see is that about 60% of the shelter capacity is now full with animals that are much more difficult to place. And so let's look at average length of stay, which I think is really a critical measurement in trying to understand success within a shelter. If we look at the 85% live release rate, what you see is that it stabilizes at about 20 days average length of stay after the end of a year. In the 95% live release case, what we see is that average length of stay has climbed up to over 90 days. So it's a huge increase in length of stay in the 95% live release case. And once again, this is because now their shelter is mostly full with much harder to place animals. So if we look at adoptions, which is so critical and fundamental to what we do after a year, and look at the cumulative adoptions, after a year what we see is there's about a 27% drop in adoptions in the 95% live release case as compared to the 85% live release case. If we look at cumulative euthanasias, in this case what we see is that in the 95% case we have reduced euthanasia by about 300 animals, but I wanted to remind you that that drop in euthanasias increased the average length of stay by 70 days. And if we look at operating costs, because although this is about animals, animals and animal sheltering operations are expensive to run. If we compare the operating cost for the 85% live release rate as compared to the 90 and 95, there's about a 50% increase in operating cost in the 95% live release rate. So we reduced euthanasia by 300 animals over the 85% live release rate, but it costs us over $500,000 to do that. And if we looked at annualized adoption revenue, what we see, there's about a 30% drop in adoption revenue from the 95 at the 95% live release rate as compared to the 85%. Somebody has asked, how is capacity determined? There were, in this particular simulation, there were 150 kennels. There was no, and the rule was that you could not double up the kennels, so it simply is that capacity is tracking how full those 150 kennels are. Okay. So complex systems require more than one metric. And the problem with live release, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the problems with live release rate as a metric. And what I mean is, the analogy I like to use is if we think about flying an airplane, we would never fly an airplane with just an altimeter. It's an absolutely critical metric in flying an airplane, but it's not sufficient. I think anybody would consider it foolhardy to fly an airplane simply with just an altimeter, and that's what I'm going to talk about with live release rate. So there's some basic problems with live release rate. One is it only looks at one aspect of animal welfare, and I just want to go back to that definition of animal welfare that I started with, that it's about the 5 freedoms. And the 5 freedoms really embrace an awful lot of different things, much more than just live release rate. And it's a metric that is the outcome of division, and that is one number divided by another. And because of that, you lose all information about scale. It becomes a unitless measurement. So 9 animals adopted from 10 intakes would be a 90% live release rate, but 90,000 animals adopted from 110,000 intakes is 81% live release rate. If you compare those two live release rates, you would have no idea about the scale difference between those two. And that's critical when we really think about impact. The other is that achieving a high live release rate is not necessarily a measure of a successful operation. You can achieve a very high live release rate several ways. Extremely limited admissions, say for example you only take in puppies, that you have no available space for arrivals, and that you're warehousing animals, that you just don't have any outcomes. And all of those will result in a high live release rate. And the other one is that it's highly dependent on the input population. And this is one that I think is a little bit subtle, but I'm going to show you why I think it is one of the most critical things to think about when we think about measuring a shelter success. So we're going to look at the impact of input population on live release rate. And we're going to compare 2 identical shelters operating at 90% live release rate with 2 different input populations. One population has more class 4 and 5 animals than the other. So in shelter 2, what you see is that it has slightly more class 4 and class 5 animals coming into it than in shelter 1. And we run the simulation, and we're going to compare the results of those 2 shelter operations running at 90% live release rate. So they're running exactly the same. And what we see as the comparison between shelter 1 and shelter 2 is that everything in shelter 2 is much worse than in shelter 1. The only thing that gets better is that euthanasias are down. But the only reason that euthanasias are down is because they've serviced far fewer animals, 2,100 versus 27. And so this is really important. The only difference, these operated exactly the same. The only difference was the type of animal coming into the shelter. And one looks so much worse than the other. And this is where when we just think about how to measure success, if we don't think about what's coming in to a system, we can't possibly judge how the success of the outputs are without the context of those inputs. And I'm going to stay on this for a little bit longer because it really is important. If we compare, we're going to compare three different intake populations. And in the blue, we've got a population distribution that has more class 5s and class 4s. In population 2, there's a little bit less class 5s and 4s. And in population 3, it just simply has class 1 through 4. So there's no class 5s in population 3. And now we're going to look at how those 3 different input populations affect performance. So if we look at total intake difference at different live release rates, so at the bottom here we have different live release rates ranging from 65 up to 100. What we see in the blue distribution that has more class 5s and 4s is that by the time you get to 100% live release rate, the number of intakes have dropped precipitously. And you see that same drop happening in the red, where there's fewer class 5s and 4s, but it still starts to drop off fairly substantially. If we look at the average length of stay at different live release rates for these 3 different input populations, what we see in the blue population that has more class 4s and 5s, as well as the red, is that as the live release rate increases, the average length of stay starts to increase substantially. If we look at total adoptions at different live release rates for these 3 populations, once again, what you see is as you start to climb in live release rate in the populations that have a higher percentage of class 4s and 5s, at a certain point that those adoptions start to drop off. So what this is really telling you that for certain intake populations, there's an optimum live release rate for maximizing adoptions as well as intakes. So input population is absolutely critical. If we look at cost per adoption at different live release rates, what you see in the distribution in the populations that have more difficult animals, you get a huge increase in cost with increasing live release rates. It's nearly exponential in the case of the blue. So what are the key points that I want to make on intake population? One is shelter performance is highly dependent on intake population. So a managed intake facility can achieve a much higher live release rate than an open admission facility. Or if you have a community that has very few difficult animals, it may be able to achieve a much higher live release rate than a community that has significant animals that are hard to place. The cost to increase live release rate is nearly exponential, both monetarily and in an overall animal welfare. And what I mean by that is that when we look at length of stay, which is certainly a proxy for one of the 5 freedoms, which is freedom to express normal behavior, an animal in a kennel is definitely not its preferred environment. I think our goal is always to get these animals into a loving home. So there's a tremendous cost, both money and in animal welfare. And each population of animals has an optimum live release rate that will maximize the number of adoptions and intakes. So there's times when you may push your live release rate up to the point where you actually are doing less impact overall when we think about number of animals served and overall animal welfare. So where does this leave us? Because I've had people tell me, well, you think live release rate is bad. And if there's anything I want you to take from this, it's not that. Live release rate has been an amazingly powerful and a productive tool for animal welfare. It's been a critical metric. But I think like anything, we need to understand its weaknesses, biases, and limitations. And one is that I keep hammering on is that it's dependent on intake population. It loses sight of scale. And it can work against animal welfare as defined by the 5 freedoms if it's used in isolation. It has to have a counterbalance. So to talk about that a little bit, I want to now think about what it looks like as if we have multiple shelters in a community. And this really is that animal welfare is a community problem. So this is going to be the tale of 2 shelters. We're in Purville now, and it has just opened up 2 identical shelters. They are exactly the same as the one opened in Wagsberg. They expect the same amount of animals. And we're going to compare 2 different cases. Case 1 is where we have a no time limit. One of the shelters is going to be operated as no time limit. The other is called municipal, which is going to take its room and euthanize only class 5 and 5S. Case 2 is going to, in the no time limit shelter, They've now limited admission to only class 1 through 4, but they'll do no euthanasia. And then the municipal, they'll take it room and limited euthanasia to only class 5S. I'm going to take a second here because I have been getting some questions, and I'll just say I think probably the easiest will be to address a lot of those questions at the end of the talk. So keep firing those questions in, and then I promise you I will get to as many of them as I can at the end of the talk. So now we're going to look at what happens in these two cases. If we look at what's showing up, what's being intaken into these two shelters, in case 1 where there's no euthanasia, in the no time limit case where there's no euthanasia but accepted room, and the municipal euthanasia only 5 and 5S and accepted room, what you see is that the intake populations are almost exactly the same. In case 2, where we've only made 2 simple policy changes, one is now the no time limit has no longer accepts any class 5s, and the municipal no longer euthanizes anything but 5S's. What we see then is there's a big increase in the municipal shelter in the hard-to-place animals. And if we compare now the shelter inventory over time, and we compare in case 1 the no time limit to the municipal, what we see is the no time limit is filling up with class 5 and 5S animals to the point that about 80% of the shelter capacity is taken up after a year. In the municipal shelter, it has stabilized around class 1 through 4s. We make those 2 simple policy changes, and what we see in the no time limit case is that it is now stabilized with class 1 through 4s, and when we look at the municipal, it's now started to fill up with 75% after a year. 75% of the animals in that shelter are class 5s, much more difficult to place. And so let's compare the results between these two cases, and what we see in the difference in performance for the municipal shelter between case 1 and case 2. Everything gets worse except for euthanasias, and the reason that their euthanasias get better is because they're intaking almost 2,000 animals less. We compare the no time limit shelter, case 1 to case 2, almost everything gets better. Their costs have gone down, their adoptions have gone up, everything looks great. But what's happened here is simply that the animals that were more difficult and harder to place have now been pushed down to the municipal shelter. And what we saw from that analysis of live release rate and the impact of input population on performance is it's simply now a reflection of the input population changing in these two shelters. So in the end, if we're going to measure success, it has to be on a community basis. It cannot necessarily be on a shelter-by-shelter basis. So this, I promise you, we do a little physics too. This is Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And I think that's the thing, that the message I really want people to take away from this is that there's a lot of reasons why we would want to increase live release rate. But we have to be really cognizant of the fact that we don't get that for free. There are consequences and actions that will happen, and we need to be prepared for that. Either our costs will go up, our length of stay will go up, we'll service less animals in our shelter. And we have to be cognizant of that, we never get anything for free. There's always an action, a reaction to any action that we take. And any planning we have should take that into account. So I'm going to show you just a couple to complete the loop of stochastic modeling, and that is really to compare the expected outcomes to real data. And so what does the model predict? In this case, the model predicts that shelters are full, especially if you have no time limits or very limited euthanasia. My colleague, Katie Parker, did a study for me and contacted over 100 no-kill shelters around the country trying to release a dog, Mr. Squish. For 50 of them, he was a boxer mix. For 50, he was a lab mix. You can see the basic scenario. The dog was having a little bit of aggression in home with her other dog, and she needed to relinquish him. Out of those 100, over 60 said no. Over 20 had no, we got no response back from. 2 said yes. The number one reason for denial was that they were full or they don't take surrenders. It would also, the model would predict that we start to get concentration of difficult animals in open admission shelters. And if we look, this is some data from Milwaukee where they have a significant pit bull overpopulation problem. And what we see over time is that the number of pit bulls on intake is now up to about 45%, even though intakes have decreased somewhat over time. The number of pit bull intakes has increased much more significantly. And we look at the percent of animals being euthanized, 70% of those animals are pit bulls. So that's exactly what we see happening here in Milwaukee as we've started to concentrate some of those much more difficult to place animals in the open admission facility. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when we think about performance, we have to understand that there's different dynamics going on in an open admission shelter as compared to a shelter that has limited or selective input. It would also, the model would also predict that we have long length of stay and high cost if we start to hang on, have very high live release rates. If we compare average length of stay this is data from a major sanctuary. In my model, it predict about 4 months. In the sanctuary, they're about 22 cost per animal. The model predicts about 17,000. They're at 19,000, so on and so forth. So what we do see, the model does fit very much what we see happening in the real world. So finally, in summary, before I take a hard left turn kind of into philosophy, live release rate is a critical metric, and it has been an incredibly powerful and effective metric improving animal welfare over the last 10 years. But it is not a sufficient measure of success. It can only be successful if we have a counterbalancing set of metrics like things like length of stay. An increasing live release rate, in this case from 85 to 95, can cause significant increase in length of stay, cost, and denial of service. The optimum live release rate for a shelter is very much dependent on the type of animals coming in. And that's something we always have to be aware of. And it's very unique for each community and each situation. And I think one that's really fundamental, your decisions greatly affect those around you. Changing an intake policy or limiting the type of animals that you take in can have a very negative effect on the other organizations within your community. We need to be aware of that. You need to work together. And for me, animal welfare is so much more than live release rate. We have to move to measure our success really on the sum total of factors that contribute to an animal's welfare. And when we think really about our organizations and our missions and what we're there to do, it's really about improving animal welfare. And we have to recognize that our organizations are just part of a system and a community, and what we do affects those around us. And when we think about building a mission-driven organization, that mission, vision, and those values have to be within the context of the entire community, not just the organization itself. And as we get better and better at what we do, and we really see that here in Colorado, we've been very blessed. But as we get better and better, we start to get faced with decisions and consequences that cannot be taken in isolation. And simplifying the world to an attribute or a decision, a single attribute or decision, will ultimately drive organizations away from their intended mission. And so I'm going to drift off into philosophy a little bit, but I think it fits, for me, becomes incredibly relevant to the whole concept of stochastic modeling. And it's really talking about the paradoxical nature of the business that we're in. And a paradox is a statement or concept that contains conflicting ideas. And one of my favorites is that I show here is I never tell the truth. And it's an amazing paradox because you know that it's true if it's false and false if it's true. And for me in animal welfare, one I see all the time is save more lives. And does this mean volume over the individual or save the individual at all costs? And how do we balance those? And following one path can often lead you to fail on the other. It's very paradoxical. And so I'm going to end and then take some questions, but really talk about something I call the live release rate paradox. And some of the many we have in this industry are the good of the one versus the good of the many. Quantity versus quality of life. And then the fine line between altruism and narcissism. And I put this one on here because for me it's a very personal reminder because I have lived this myself. I had a dog, his name was Cooper. He was a border collie. I got him when I was in college. He was with me through my Ph.D. He was with me in Houston when I lived apart from my wife for a year and a half. He was my buddy. I mean, our lives were deeply integrated together. And when he was 15, he got cancer, pretty bad cancer. And I hung on to him for about another 6 months before I realized I needed to let him go. And I put him down. And in hindsight, I look at that. I mean, he was my buddy for so long. And when I look at that last 6 months of his life now, I realize that I let my own personal needs start to overtake the need to be a good guardian for him. And that has stuck with me to this day. It's been a while since he's been gone, but that memory and that emotion of thinking about losing sight of what my partnership with him was all about keeps me really motivated about improving animal welfare. And so for me, it's really time to move past simplistic labels and singular metrics. It's really going forward. I think it's really about the 5 freedoms and judging our success around the 5 freedoms. And we can't save them all, but we can be humane to them all, and that's what we're really all about. We're here to be humane. And with that, I will open it up to questions, and I'm sure I'll get some on chat, and I will try to answer as many as I can. And this is my little paradoxical comedy at the end. So I'll go to what I see on the chat here right now. Somebody asked me about kennels, whether it was a mix of cats and dogs. In this case, I simply just ran just one species, but I am working on models that have multiple species and multiple different outcomes. It doesn't really change the basic fundamental conclusions that you see in this model. In some ways, when you add in cats, things get even tougher. Let's see. All right, I will wait, I guess, for more questions.
Roger, those are the only questions I've gotten by email, but I understand some of the questions have been coming directly to you on chat.
They have. Oof. Yeah. I'm not sure how to see those. Huh. I don't see any questions. Where would it be? And
unfortunately, I don't have access to chat. They're not showing up. Jeannie just had mentioned that they were going directly to you.
All right.
So since we have a few minutes, we can certainly ask people to either post on chat or email rbarbeers@anticruelty.org with any questions.
Yeah, this is a bummer. I can't see the questions. Huh.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, I would like to thank you, Roger, for an excellent presentation. And I hope all of those who are listening today have some food for thought. You've given us a lot to think about, and I've heard this for the second time. I'm still awed by the work you've done. And a reminder to everyone, this webinar will be available on the SAWA website, www.sawanetwork.org/events, within 3 business days. Jeannie, are you on? Can you help to see if there's any questions? Okay, I just got an email, Roger, from someone saying, look at the icon flashing in the upper right. I don't see one on my screen, but that might help with questions. And here's another question. Is there a way that we can calculate our own optimal live release rate?
Yes, and I think there's each organization's a little bit different, but I've been working to try to generalize the model so that we can start to have this be a more general tool that any shelter or community could start to look at. This work's still fairly new, but that is the goal, to be able to start to use it as a way for communities to understand what the right live release rate would be, and how and what it would take to increase their live release rate, because I think that's still always our goal, is to save as many animals as possible. But yes, that's where this work is headed.
And here's another question. How do fosters and dedicated rescues factor into these statistics?
In this model, I did not utilize fosters or rescues, but what I think it does show is that that is such a critical element of the whole sheltering animal welfare system. And the real key there is that they can really help offload some of those the challenges in capacity. But the real key is that they have to work really closely with the shelters so that that system gets tuned. And I think fostering and rescues are just absolutely critical in trying to help overcome some of the challenges in environments where we really, the shelter can get overwhelmed. So I think that's what kind of my dream would be, that we can start to use this tool to start to figure out what's the best role for each, the shelter and the rescue, to play, and what kind of animals are best. But that is a critical element in really the long-term management for any community.
All right, we're getting some more questions here. What software program are you using to analyze this data, and what would you recommend for a regular shelter to use?
Right now, this is just a program that I've written myself in Visual Basic, and hopefully over the next couple years, we'll be able to roll this out in a form that would be more usable. Certainly I'm trying to reach out and help as many people as possible and get them thinking about these questions. It's not it's not like a commercial piece of software at this point.
Okay, I think that answers Jen's question too. How do we get the model? Somebody else asked, how do you assign an animal class? Could you assign a relative fitness value based on adoption data versus intake data?
Yes. So I just, in this particular model, I just kind of approximated the Asilomar classifications, but I think I've been talking to a few people about trying, it's really kind of I guess would describe it as a level of difficulty in placement. And I think there's a body of work and conversation that needs to be had around how do we start to kind of think about intake and classifications in a more predictive way. And I think having that kind of scaled parameter in the end is going to be more powerful, because there's going to be it's not going to necessarily just be a particular breed or a particular behavior. It's going to really depend on the community as to kind of the level of difficulty it is to place a particular animal.
Okay, and here's another question. How do you picture organizations talking to their communities about this? Our live release rate is X, but here is some other data. Or our live release is X, and that seems about right because, and the person asking the question said it seems to be the right message, but cumbersome to talk about. Are there any shelters who are doing a good job messaging this?
I think, well, first off, I think it's really about animal welfare. So I think the key is to really start to talk about the things that we know people care about. I think most of the public does not want an animal to spend a year in a shelter. I think most of the public does not want an animal to suffer. And so I think it's about shifting it away from a number to really about describing and touching the emotional aspects that the 5 freedoms can bring. And I think the more we talk about animal welfare in terms of the 5 freedoms, it is a very relatable framework that I think is much more powerful than live release rates. And I think it's not there yet, and I think it's about where we're headed as an industry, that we've gotten to this point where we need to make it a more robust conversation, but we can't lose the compassion and emotion, and that's what I really like about the 5 freedoms. You know, some groups here in Colorado, and they're the ones I'm most familiar with, I think have done a good job talking about the broader scope of animal welfare beyond live release rates. So I think that's really, I think that's where we're headed as an industry. I hope that's where we're headed, and I think the 5 freedoms, if we learn how to message it well, is incredibly relatable to people, the average person in the community that likes animals.
Okay. And we're still scrolling through, getting more questions. Here's one. If you were working with a public shelter with a high intake, with a high percentage of Class 5 and 5S dogs, how would this analysis impact policy decisions and the rate of success? For example, a community shelter with 5,000 intakes that has reduced its euthanasia rate to 49% is still a terrible rate. But if the public entity has limited or strained resources, would you measure euthanasia rates against quality of care, for example, overcrowding? Or would you analyze your available resources and then manage your expectations regarding live release rates and euthanasia?
That is a great question. I think the first is that the metrics need to be community-based. So most communities have more than one facility, and they have rescue groups and fosters. And I think it's about measuring success of all those groups together, and not just, you know, say the resource-constrained municipal shelter or whatever it may be. And it's about really building that community awareness around the need, those needs as a community. So, so I think that is key, so that everybody's on the same page in terms of success, and it's all for one and one for all in a community like that where you have one organization that is struggling. And then I think you can start to see and use that to raise everybody's boat. And I do think it's about measuring, coming up with a broader set of metrics around the 5 freedoms and length of stay and ability to handle those animals in a reasonable set of care standards is critical. So a great question. I'm not sure I answered that very well, other than the best thing we can do is start to really view and come together and view our metrics as a community.
And Jeannie wanted me to remind everyone that this presentation is going to be available within the next 3 working days on the SAWA's website at sawanetwork.org/events. And I would recommend that you have your board listen to it and get all your community involved listening to this to start getting that idea out there. I've got a couple more questions here. I think you answered those. Everyone wants that perfect formula, Roger.
Well, I think it's about working together. Certainly, my email's on the presentation. Feel free to email me. I think this is about, this is what I wanted to give you was a framework, and I think it's about all of us working together now to think about how to utilize that framework in each one of our communities. And there's a lot of great ideas out there. My goal was to try to spur on some good ideas and some new thinking and really, in the end, improve animal welfare.
And another question, is there a recommended set of stats to chart to have as a comparison with the live release rates?
This work is so new, I don't think anybody's quite had a chance to really think about what that kind of dashboard, that airplane console looks like. For me, one thing that we've added here in Colorado is length of stay. And I think length of stay is really a critical counterbalance to live release rate, because if you can get both your length of stay to drop and your live release rate to go up, you've got a pretty good sense that you're headed on the right path. You must be placing animals pretty quickly, getting them into the homes. I think that's another area of work that needs to be done. I think there's some groups like Shelter Animals Count and some others out there that are really thinking about metrics and measuring in ways that I think fit a lot of these ideas.
Okay, I think we've answered any last-minute questions for Roger. We still have a few minutes. I know Jeannie emailed me and said a lot of people have had their questions answered and logged off and have thanked. Oh, one just came in. Oh, this is an interesting one. What about the term no-kill? Many with a 90% live release rate are indicating they are then a no-kill shelter. Can you address this terminology?
Yeah, for me, I think the term itself, when you look at it, there's just it doesn't have a lot of meaning because there's not an agreement on what it actually means, which means that it's somewhat arbitrary. And I think just picking a number and calling it no-kill doesn't really serve a lot of purpose and it really doesn't relate to animal welfare in any meaningful or scientific way. So I think it's really about moving beyond that term. I think when we think about what we want to accomplish, it's really about addressing the 5 freedoms in animal welfare. And because the term itself is divisive and arbitrary, it doesn't really, for me, provide any framework for going forward.
Thank you. Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed this seminar as much as I have. Finally, someone is actually putting some data to a lot of the questions that we've struggled with over the years. Oh, one other question just came in. Our county has a private no-kill shelter, but all the animals it doesn't take. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Our county has a private no-kill shelter, but all the animals that get turned away at the private shelter go to the public shelter, which, as you would expect, has a high euthanasia rate. The public shelter is criticized for the high euthanasia rate. How would that shape an advocate's approach to the public?
Well, I think that's what I was really trying to show in the community model was, I think when we talk to the public, we need to really start to have language that and communication around this is a community problem. We can't view these as separate. And it really, when I talked about mission organizations, you know, organizational missions, they have to go outside the walls of each organization. So I think my hope is that what I've shown you guys today can help maybe start to frame that conversation for the community so that they understand that question isn't sufficient, that we really have to talk about how everything is happening in the community. And if we can prevent those animals from being unwanted in the first place, fundamentally so many of the issues that we face in animal sheltering really start to go away.
And can you go over any more ideas for counterbalancing metrics?
I think so. I think really for me it's about looking at throughput measurements. So how many animals have you moved? How long were they there? I think cost per animal is an important one because especially in communities where there are more animals than a particular shelter that can handle, there's some great analogies in the business world, and a book that I highly recommend is called The Goal, and it's really about thinking about throughput through a system. And I think there's some, when we think about sheltering, it really, the goal is to, if there's an unwanted animal, is to get it in and get it out. And the more positive outcomes we can get, the better. So I think there needs to be some definition around throughput. So inventory, looking at all those kind of length of stay. And it really is, I think, a body of work where we need some good minds to get together and think about what those metrics need to be.
And the book you mentioned is The Goal?
It's called The Goal by Elijah Goldratt. It's a pretty easy read. It's a great challenge. It's got some really interesting concepts on how to think about operational performance. And I've used it in some of my consulting work with some shelters.
Great, and I don't see any more questions coming in. So again, I want to remind everyone that this webinar is going to be available at sawa.org/events within 3 business days. And I encourage you all to share it with as many people as you can. This is really wonderful work that Roger started, and it has given us a lot to think about. I can't thank you enough, Roger, for participating in this seminar, and I'm so glad I got to hear it again.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate everybody that logged in today. It means a lot to me.
And a special thanks to Sawa for doing this, and for Jeannie for organizing our very first webinar, and hopefully one of many to come.